Okay guys, many of you wanted to see some of the games that I played in that rapid tournament that I tweeted about. And actually I wanted to start with this one because my opponent, another national master, actually played this sort of a Colle system against our King's Indian defense. And by the way guys, at this point, we could play with d5, we could play with d6, which is what we typically do in the King's Indian defense, followed by knight b to d7, probably e5, or we could do what I actually did in the game. And if I show you, the engine actually recommends c5 as the top move. So that would be slightly better for black, actually even. Now, guys, this is for you to see that we're not done with the King's Indian defense. We have an entire playlist on it, but this repertoire with the c5 ideas is a little bit combining King's Indian defense with the Grunfeld, which we have to cover as well. So long way to go. My opponent here plays bishop b2, very natural. And now I play pawn to d5, and after castle, knight c6. Guys, a couple things about this. Number one, I could continue to do queen c7, rook e8, try to do e5. And for those of you who still don't see it, this looks a lot like the Catalan with Colle reversed. And I know that I'm always talking to you about the Colle reversed. Well, there are ideas from one opening that we could use in another one, and this is the case. So I'm thinking queen c7, knight d7, trying to do e5 like we do in the Catalan. So anyhow, after knight c6, we got pawn to a3. Now knight to d7, number one. I know that they're doing a3 in the Colle. We had a lesson on it, and they don't want us to do knight b4, but I'm also a little bit concerned that they might take, opening up the bishop, and then b4. So I just said, you know what, let me do knight d7. It is consistent with my plan of doing e5, and at the same time, I'm defending the pawn on c5. So knight d7, then pawn to c4. And again, going back to lesson 107, guys, I told you when we have this kind of tension in the center, depending on how we capture, we could get different kinds of pawn structures. And by now, you should know how to play with, against, isolated pawns, hanging pawns, and so on. So here, I knew what I was looking for, so I took on c4, my opponent took with the bishop, and after c takes c4, e takes c4, I identified an isolated queen pawn. Guys, we've had multiple lessons on it. We know that we have to target that pawn, we have to obstruct it, ideally with the knight, and then put pressure on it. There are good things for the white pieces too, but I enjoy playing against it. Now, if they had taken here, by the way, with the pawn, then we get into hanging pawns. We know what the white pieces should be trying to do, and we also know what we should be trying to provoke. If you don't know, you gotta go back to those lessons. In this game, guys, d takes e4, bishop takes, c takes e4, and then after e takes e4, of course, knight b6, not only trying to get to d5 to block that pawn, but also trying to get their pair of bishops. So my opponent plays h3, and now I didn't think twice to capture the bishop. Yes, they don't have an isolated pawn anymore, but now I got the pair of bishops, and my opponent has hanging pawns. Now, for those of you who are new to the course, guys, basically the white pieces want to keep those pawns as they are, because like that, they control the center. For me, I want to provoke the advancement of one of those pawns. If they push, let's say I do a bad move, I don't know, h5, if they do c5, automatically this is available for my pieces. If they do d5, automatically e5 and c5 are available for my pieces. So after b takes e4, I go queen b6. It's nice to gain a tempo on the bishop, and now I'm making the 8 available for my rook. So queen b6, and now my opponent plays a pretty interesting move, which is rook a2, protecting the bishop, but also this rook could come over through the second rank to protect the pawn, or simply to get ready to advance and attack, right? So rook a2, now I continue with rook d8. Very simple, guys. We're not doing anything extraordinary. All of you who have been following these lessons in order, you should be able to come up with this move on your own. So rook d8, now we got c5. Happy to see this move happening because this is exactly what I needed. I move my queen out, and guys, pay attention to the light squares. They don't have a light square bishop, and I do. So the moment I develop my bishop, I'm going to be the owner of those light squares, and especially that d5. So queen a6, then pawn to d5, my opponent played it, and now bishop e6. The pawn is pinned, so I'm happy to put pressure on it. Now, my opponent takes, and instead of playing impulsively and just capturing back on g7, I wanted to do an in-between move. Now, I played rook takes d5, but if you look at the engine says bishop d5 is way stronger. But it is what it is, so rook d5. At this point, I considered my opponent could play bishop d4, but they just went rook d2. And then, of course, I just simplified, followed by king g7. At this point, guys, if I show you again, we converted that small advantage that we had to 1.53. This is huge. I don't have my pro bishops anymore, but I'm up a pawn. And we know these are going to be long-term liability for my opponent. Isolated pawns and weaknesses on the light squares, this should be sufficient for us to convert. Now, we got queen b2, check. I don't want to compromise anything, no pinning my pawns, just king g8, knight g5. Of course, I don't want to give up my light square bishop, and this is something that I had present through the entire game. I knew we've had so many lessons talking about this, so I kept telling myself, we gotta keep that bishop to dominate the light squares. And also, I don't want to get the double pawns. So bishop f5, and at this point, my opponent goes queen b3, putting pressure on b7, on f7, and notice that, guys, my opponent knows he's strategically lost, so he's looking for complications, little things, and all I need to do is keep things under control. So I just went rook f8, just bringing my rook to defend, and the idea is that I don't want to give him anything. I know that this move I'm wasting here probably because I'm going to bring the rook to the open file. I know it's like a waste of a move, but it is the same move my opponent is wasting when I kick the knight out. So rook f8, then g4, my bishop gets out of the way by gaining a tempo on the rook. That rook moves out of the way by gaining a tempo on the bishop, and then my bishop gets out of the way by gaining a tempo on the queen. And you see how I'm dancing through those light squares because they are weak. So bishop c4, queen goes to c3, and finally we kick the knight out. So knight e4, and now my rook comes over to claim the open file. Guys, I know that I'm not going to lose this. The closer we get to the end game, the easier it will be to convert. So that's why I'm offering the trade of rooks. But also, my opponent cannot get any counterplay. This rook getting to the 7th rank is a big no. So rook d8. My opponent is happy to trade because now my knight is passive, but also they have queen d2, hitting the knight and hitting the pawn. Now, in my mind, I'm not concerned. I'm thinking I'm going to go knight e6. Knight is active. They get the pawn, which is the extra pawn that I had. So now we're even, but I keep the more powerful bishop and my opponent still has the isolated pawns. So I was okay with this. And if I show you the engine, guys, this is 3.43. So we converted small advantage into a bigger advantage, 1.50, and now 3.43. So after queen h6, I just went bishop d3. My bishop continues to put pressure through the light squares, knight c3, and now queen c4. Guys, and by the way, I showed you another game that I played against a Grandmaster on Title Tuesday where I was able to win also by working on the light square. So queen c4, no rush to take the pawns. Seriously, these pawns are going to fall sooner or later. I just need to continue to put pressure to keep his pieces passive. And now this queen has to go back, queen e3. And now, guys, my next move, I was so proud of it when I reviewed this game with the engine because actually it's a top choice for the engine. And feel free to pause the video, but the move was actually pawn to g5. And let me actually go back here to show you. Notice how we could have done king f8, king g7, we're going to be fine. But g5 was very attractive because number one, it is a pawn that stops too. We've talked about this before, but also I know my knight wants to be in the center, and for that we need support. So g5 controlling the dark squares as well, and my knight is coming to f4 to put pressure on the king. So my opponent goes king h2 right away, and now I'm thinking these knights cannot move. They're defending each other. If one moves, then I get the other one. The queen has to be defending, so they're sort of like in a 6-1 almost. So I started to push my pawns. Why? I know it's going to come down to it. When this pawn falls, I want to have my pawn as close to the finish line as possible. So a5 was played, then queen e5. And if you remember when we had that lesson on the pair of bishops, guys, I told you one of the benefits of the pair of bishops is that you could give it up whenever you want. Well, I tried to apply the same principle with my powerful bishop. I could give it up whenever I wanted. So I took here now, followed by queen c2, hitting the knight, hitting the pawn, hitting c5. And I know my opponent could defend with something like queen e1, but look how passive those pieces are going to be compared to my pieces. So again, guys, nothing extraordinary, keeping my opponent quiet. And of course, my opponent did not want to go to e1, so he played queen f5 instead. And here, look, if I show you one more time, oh, actually you can see the engine chose 458 if I had played queen b2. Queen c1 was also powerful, as well as queen a2. Well, in my mind, I'm thinking, I want to go into an endgame that I know how to win, something that I'm comfortable with. So instead of doing queen b2, queen c1, I just said, I'm going to take the queen. This is going to be a pretty easy endgame when I take the pawn, because now 2 versus 1, I'm going to have an outside pass pawn. The king will not be able to get to it, so I know how to win this. And by the way, if you look at the evaluation, still winning, it's 2.06, but it's not as big as 4 point something. But again, guys, I'm not looking for anything fancy. This, I know how to win. So anyhow, I get to this endgame. In my mind, I'm thinking, I just need a pass pawn. The knight is going to have to be sacrificed for it. I got this. So knight c3. Now king g7. I need to activate the king, of course. King g3. Knight d3. Trying to get to that pawn. And once I get the pawn, that's it. So knight e4. b5. All I need, guys, again, is my pass pawn. So king f3. And here, I missed the opportunity to do king e5, knight e5, knight c4, or knight e1, knight c2 to get the pawn. But still, I was focused on my goal. And then, guys, after 8 takes before, this is the question to you. Would you take with the knight, or would you take with the pawn? Well, in my mind, and if you look at the engine, guys, the right move is taking with the knight. I need my pawn to be as far away from the action on the king side, okay? Because either the king has to go far to get him, or the knight has to go far to get him. So with that said, my opponent here just went king g4, and all I'm thinking now is advancing my pawn. So a4, get my pawn, that's okay, a3, and then here I was expecting my opponent to do something like knight c5, knight b3, but even in that case, they were going to have to give me the knight for the pawn, and my knight was going to be on time to come over and win the game. But my opponent got a little bit confused here. They played f6, and after e takes f6, the game was pretty much over. But even, guys, if I show you back here, this is already completely winning, but even with a move like this is 3.50, so this should be pretty easy to win. So again, pretty simple game. We didn't do anything extraordinary, but it helps us reinforce everything that we have talked about up to this point in the course. Now, about the c5 move in the opening, this is something that we're going to cover in the near future. But in the meantime, guys, let me know in the comments if you found some value in this lesson, and I will see you in our next video.